London, 1940. The morning sky breaks in hues of amber and grey as Edward Thompson rises from his makeshift bed in the underground station. Another night of bombs, another day of survival. At 63, Edward has lived through one great war already, but nothing prepared him for this. His beloved city transformed into a maze of rubble and resilience. His routine remains unchanged. Check on neighbors, queue for rations, repair what can be salvaged. Each ordinary task now an act of quiet defiance against Hitler's Luftwaffe. The air raid sirens will wail again tonight, as they have for 57 consecutive evenings. In his pocket, a worn photograph of his late wife, Elizabeth. On his workbench, an unfinished wooden music box. Will he complete it before the next bomb finds its mark? The worn tin kettle whistled softly, its dented body a testament to survival much like its owner. Edward removed it from the small spirit stove that served as the communal cooking sauce in this corner of Holborn Station. 3 months ago, such an ordinary object would have sat on his kitchen stove, not balanced precariously on a makeshift shelf in an underground tunnel. "Tea's ready, Mrs. Finch," Edward called quietly to the elderly woman whose sleeping space neighbored his. Her grey hair was meticulously pinned, despite the circumstances, a small victory against chaos. "Bless you, Eddie. Any news yet?" Her voice carried the same Hackney accent that had colored their morning exchanges for nearly 60 nights now. Edward poured the hot water into 2 chipped cups, the tea leaves swirling in a familiar dance. Radio announcement should come through shortly. Sounded like the East End took the worst of it last night. Around them, the underground station stirred to life. Children were being dressed, faces washed with precious water from canteens. Working adults prepared for jobs still functioning, despite the Luftwaffe's nightly efforts. A young mother nursed her infant beneath a carefully hung blanket for privacy. The tinny voice of the BBC announcer crackled through the portable wireless set belonging to Mr. Pembridge, a retired postal worker who kept the station's makeshift community informed. German bombers targeted the Docklands again last night, with incendiary bombs causing fires in Stepney and Poplar. His Majesty's Fire Services report the blazes are now under control. Citizens are advised that unexploded ordnance has been identified in Clerkenwell and Marylebone. Edward sipped his tea, its warmth a small comfort. Before the war, mornings with Elizabeth had followed the same pattern for 38 years. She would prepare breakfast while he read the morning paper. The kettle, the same one he now used in this subterranean world, would whistle precisely at 7:15. Now Elizabeth was 5 years gone from cancer, and the morning paper was a luxury few could justify with the paper shortages. "You heading up to check your house then?" Mrs. Finch asked, wrapping her arthritic hands around her cup. "Need to see if the roof's still attached after that close one around midnight." Edward nodded. "And I've work to finish in my shop if it's still standing. That music box for Elizabeth." Edward nodded, the familiar ache in his chest at the mention of his wife's name, never quite dulling. "Promised her I'd finish it. War or no war." Mrs. Finch patted his hand. "You're a good man, Eddie Thompson." Edward gathered his few belongings, gas mask box, an extra jumper, his identity card, and the small photograph of Elizabeth he kept wrapped in oilcloth. His bed space was neatly organized, blankets folded with military precision, a habit from his service in the Great War. "Mr. Thompson," called a young voice. Timothy Wright, age 10, approached with his usual morning solemnity. "Could you check if our street's all right? Mum's worried about Gran who wouldn't come to shelter." Edward nodded, making a mental note to pass by Dorset Street on his route. "I'll knock on her door myself, lad." As Edward prepared to climb the stairs into whatever London had become overnight, he observed the underground society that had formed. Strangers 3 months ago, now a tight-knit community. Mrs. Harrow teaching makeshift lessons to a group of school-aged children. Dr. Blackwell checking on an elderly man's cough. 2 women comparing recipes for stretching rations. "Back for the evening siren, Eddie?" called Mr. Pembridge. "God willing," Edward replied, the standard answer among those who ventured above during daylight hours. He climbed the stairs slowly, his left knee stiff from sleeping on the hard ground. The morning light hit his face as he emerged, bringing with it the now familiar scent of cordite, dust, and the unmistakable smell of buildings still smoldering from the night's assault. Edward inhaled deeply. Another day, another chance to continue. The kettle, tucked safely in his rucksack, had boiled water for tea this morning. It would do so again tomorrow. In a world gone mad, such small certainties were everything. Edward adjusted the strap on his gas mask box, the cardboard container worn at the edges from constant carrying. Government instructions to keep it always at hand had seemed excessive at first. Now, after witnessing a neighbor caught without one during a surprise daylight gas drill, Edward understood. The box swung at his side as he navigated what had once been the familiar path toward Pembridge Street. London revealed herself differently each morning. Streets that had been passable yesterday might be blocked by rubble today. Buildings that had stood proudly for centuries could vanish overnight, leaving only dust and memories. Edward had developed a habit of mentally cataloguing the changes, a private map of destruction and survival. The dome of St. Paul's still dominated the skyline, somehow spared night after night, while buildings around it crumbled. A small miracle, people called it. A sign to keep faith. Morning Mr. Thompson, called an RP warden, his tin hat askew and face smudged with soot. Young Parker had been a bank clerk before the war. Now, at 23, he had the eyes of a much older man. How bad was it, Parker? Lost the entirety of Marchmont Street. Direct hit on the bakers. Poor souls. Parker shook his head, the weight of the information evident in the slump of his shoulders. You heading home then? Checking on my place, yes. Then might help with the bucket brigade if they need hands. Parker nodded. Mind the corner by the old library. Unexploded one they haven't defused yet. Cordoned off, but best give it wide berth. Edward thanked him and continued, taking the detour. The once impressive library was now a hollow shell, books and knowledge reduced to ash. He'd spent many Sunday afternoons there with Elizabeth after church, her fingers trailing lovingly over leather-bound volumes she couldn't afford to own. A small group had gathered at an intersection, helping an elderly woman clear debris from her shop entrance. Without hesitation, Edward set down his bag and joined them, passing larger chunks of masonry down a human chain to the growing pile by the curb. Much obliged, the shopkeeper said when they'd cleared enough for her to wedge open the door. Don't have much, but there's tea if anyone wants it. Edward declined politely and continued his journey, stopping briefly to help a young mother navigate a pram over a section of uneven pavement where bomb tremors had buckled the concrete. Her infant slept peacefully, unaware of the destruction surrounding them. Passing the primary school, Edward noted the windows had been sandbagged again after last week's blast had dislodged the previous protection. The playground stood empty, the children evacuated months ago to the countryside. He sometimes wondered about the Wright boy and why he hadn't been sent away like the others. Family circumstances, he supposed. Not everyone had relatives in safer areas, willing to take in extra mouths to feed. The sudden wail of air raid sirens sent pedestrians scurrying for cover. Edward's heart rate quickened despite his experience. Daylight raids were less common, but increasingly frequent as the Germans altered tactics. He quickened his pace toward the nearest public shelter, joining a stream of Londoners well practiced in the drill. Inside the brick surface shelter, Edward found himself pressed between strangers in the dim light. Their collective breath created a fog in the chilled air. A young woman clutched her gas mask box to her chest like a shield. Edward noticed her white-knuckled grip matching his own. False alarm, most like, offered a man in workman's clothes. Jerry's just keeping us on our toes. Sure enough, the all clear sounded 15 minutes later. Emerging into daylight, Edward continued his journey, now with greater urgency. The interruption reminded him how precious each normal moment had become, how each simple task completed was a small victory against chaos. As Pembridge Street came into view, Edward felt the familiar mixture of dread and hope. Would his home still stand? The roof had survived dozens of raids, but luck eventually ran out for everyone in this lottery of destruction. The gas mask box knocked rhythmically against his hip as he quickened his pace, useless against high explosives, but regulation was regulation. He'd carried heavier burdens in the First War, physically and otherwise. This small inconvenience was nothing compared to the weight of worry for his daughter across London or his son somewhere in North Africa with the 8th Army. Rounding the final corner, Edward held his breath as he always did at this moment of truth, when he would learn whether his life's possessions and memories remained or had joined the growing mountain of London's sacrifices to this terrible new kind of warfare. Relief washed over Edward as his house came into view, still standing among its less fortunate neighbours. The east side of Pembridge Street had taken a beating. The Peterson place was now just a skeleton of timber and brick dust, and the corner shop had lost its entire front. But number 27, the narrow terrace house that had been Edward's home for 40 years, remained stubbornly intact despite new damage to the slate roof. The family clock in the front parlour had stopped at precisely 9:37, the night the first bomb fell on their street. Edward never rewound it, leaving it as a silent witness to the moment everything changed. He stepped carefully over a new pile of debris in his small front garden and pushed open the door that never quite sat right after the blast wave from 3 weeks ago. "Hello, house," he said quietly, a ritual greeting that had begun after Elizabeth passed. Talking to empty rooms had seemed mad at first, but these days everyone in London held tight to their own varieties of sanity. Inside, plaster dust covered the furnishings like early frost. A new crack ran diagonally across the ceiling, joining an intricate web of fissures that mapped each nearby explosion. The framed wedding photograph on the mantel had toppled again. Edward righted it, wiping dust from Elizabeth's smiling face with his handkerchief. He moved methodically through the rooms, cataloguing fresh damage. A window in the back bedroom had finally given up, its glass scattered across Margaret's old quilted bedspread. He carefully folded the quilt and placed it in the trunk at the foot of the bed, where it would be protected from the next inevitable breach. In the kitchen he found water pooled beneath the sink, where a pipe had finally succumbed to the persistent shaking of nightly raids. He placed a pot beneath the slow drip and made a mental note to salvage some rubber from the bombed-out garage down the street for repairs. Mr. Thompson, are you there?" A woman's voice called from the front garden. Edward found Mrs. Winters from number 33 at his door, her hair covered in a faded scarf, eyes wide with urgency. "Have you seen Winston? I can't find him anywhere, and with all this new rubble—" Her voice caught as she gestured toward what remained of the houses at the end of the street. "Your cat?" "No, but I've only just arrived. Let me help you look," Edward offered, setting down his bag inside the door. They searched methodically through gardens and rubble piles, calling for the orange tabby that had become something of a street mascot. Edward was checking beneath a fallen section of garden wall when he heard a faint mewing. "I think he's here, Mrs. Winters." Edward gently moved aside pieces of broken trellis to reveal the cat, miraculously unharmed, but thoroughly indignant about his predicament. Mrs. Winters gathered the dusty animal into her arms, tears tracking clean lines down her soot-smudged cheeks. "Thank you. He's all I have left, you know, since Albert." Edward nodded. Her husband had been an air raid warden, killed during a rescue attempt in the first month of heavy bombing. "Winston's a survivor, like the rest of us." After ensuring Mrs. Winters and her cat were safely home, Edward returned to his house, suddenly decided. The music box in his workshop needed to be finished. Not tomorrow, not when the raids eased, but today. The clock, frozen at 9:37, reminded him that time was a luxury, none of them were guaranteed. In the parlour, he looked at the photographs lining the mantelpiece, Elizabeth on their wedding day, Margaret in her school uniform, Thomas in his new army kit. The empty space waited for a photograph of Margaret's coming baby, a grandchild he might never meet if his luck ran out. His gaze returned to the stopped clock, its hands permanently marking the moment when the first bomb had fallen near enough to shake the house off its foundation. Before and after, everything in London was measured that way now. Before the Blitz and during it, no one spoke of after. After was a luxury of imagination most couldn't afford. Edward ran his fingers over the clock's silent face, remembering how its steady ticking had been the heartbeat of their home. How many significant moments had it witnessed? Margaret's first steps across the parlour rug, Thomas learning to read in the armchair beside it, Elizabeth's last days in the makeshift sickbed they'd arranged by the fire so she could be part of family life until the end. He turned away from the frozen timepiece and headed toward the cellar door. The workshop below had been his refuge before the war. Now, it would be his act of defiance, creating something beautiful while destruction reigned from above. The cellar steps creaked under Edward's weight as he descended into his workshop. Unlike the upper floors of the house, this space remained largely unchanged by the bombing. Something about being underground, perhaps. The same reason thousands of Londoners now slept in tube stations. The earth absorbed what the buildings above could not. Edward pulled the cord on the single light bulb, illuminating his sanctuary. tools hung in perfect order on the wall, a system unchanged since he first arranged them 30 years ago. His workbench stood solid and waiting, and upon it Elizabeth's unfinished music box. He ran his fingers over the half-completed walnut case, feeling the grain of the wood. He had started it 4 years ago, when the doctor first said the word cancer in that careful, measured tone that immediately told them both it was serious. Elizabeth had asked for something to remember him by, assuming she would outlive him, as was common for women of their generation. Fate had other plans. "I'm still working on it, Lizzie," he said to the empty room. "Taking longer than I promised, but there's been a war on, you know." Edward opened the drawer beneath his workbench and removed the mechanism he'd been painstakingly crafting. Brass gears and springs nested together in delicate precision. He'd been a watchmaker's apprentice before the Great War, and though life had taken him in different directions afterward, the skills remained in his hands. The tune would be Greensleeves, Elizabeth's favorite. She used to hum it while gardening, while cooking, while rocking their children to sleep. Edward could still hear her voice, soft and slightly off-key, in the most endearing way. "Let's see if this spring tension is right," he murmured, adjusting a tiny screw with practiced fingers. At 63, his eyesight wasn't what it once was, but decades of detailed work had taught him to feel what he could no longer see clearly. He remembered the promise made as he sat beside her bed in those final days. The morphine had made her drift in and out, but in one lucid moment, she'd squeezed his hand and whispered, "Finish my music box, Eddie, so I can still sing to our grandchildren someday." Now, with Margaret expecting, that promise carried even greater weight. The cylinder that would carry the melody pins needed to be aligned precisely. Edward had salvaged the brass for it from the doorknob of the church hall after it had been destroyed in September. There was something fitting about that, the church where they'd married, where their children had been christened, living on in this small way. He worked steadily, losing himself in the familiar rhythm of creation. Down here, with his tools and his memories, he could almost forget the war raging above. Almost, but not quite. The distant thuds of anti-aircraft guns firing from the park reminded him that this peaceful moment was merely an intermission in the ongoing symphony of destruction. From his pocket, Edward removed a small package wrapped in oilcloth. Inside was the most crucial piece of the music box, a hand-carved wooden hummingbird that would rise and spin when the lid was opened. Elizabeth had loved the hummingbirds they'd seen on their one holiday to Cornwall before the children came. "They remind me of joy in constant motion," she'd said. Edward set the tiny figure on the workbench and examined his previous work. The balance wasn't quite right. It would need a counterweight to spin properly. He rummaged through his collection of oddments until he found a small piece of lead, salvaged from the stained glass window of their church after it had been blown out in the October raids. As he worked to attach the lead to the base of the carving, his mind wandered to the night he'd proposed to Elizabeth. They'd been walking home from a dance, and he'd been carrying the ring in his pocket all evening, waiting for the perfect moment. It had started to rain, one of those sudden English downpours that appear from clear skies, and they'd run for shelter under the awning of a watchmaker's shop. Looking back, perhaps that had been an omen pointing toward his future trade. A particularly loud explosion, closer than the others, shook dust from the cellar ceiling. Edward steadied his hand, refusing to let the war interfere with this act of creation and memory. Each component of this music box contained not just his craftsmanship, but fragments of their life together, salvaged, repurposed, transformed. The light flickered overhead as another explosion rumbled through the ground. Edward glanced up, his concentration momentarily broken. Time was running short. Soon, the evening air raids would begin in earnest, and he would need to decide whether to risk staying in his Anderson shelter in the garden or return to the deeper safety of the underground station. The wail of sirens pulled Edward from his concentration. He carefully set down the tiny screwdriver and listened, years of experience allowing him to distinguish the different patterns. This was no practice alert or false alarm. The steady rise and fall meant enemy aircraft approaching. Daylight raids had become more common as the Luftwaffe varied their tactics, catching people away from their usual night shelters. Edward's gaze fell on the handwritten shelter protocol list tacked to the wall beside his workbench. Elizabeth had created it during the first weeks of bombing, her neat handwriting itemizing what to grab in order of importance: gas mask, identity card, water, torch, radio, blanket, photograph. He had followed her list religiously since her passing, finding comfort in adhering to her practical foresight. Now, he quickly gathered the items, placing the music box components carefully in a small wooden case that slipped into his jacket pocket. The decision loomed: return to Holborn Station or use the Anderson shelter in the back garden. The public shelters were safer, buried deeper underground, but the 30-minute walk during an active raid carried its own risks. The Anderson, partially buried and reinforced with sandbags, would protect against all but a direct hit. A frantic knocking at the front door made the decision for him. "Mr. Thompson, Mr. Thompson, are you home?" The voice belonged to Mrs. Gladwell from 2 streets over. Edward hurried upstairs to find her standing on his doorstep, clutching the hand of her 7-year-old grandson. Both were breathless, the boy's eyes wide with barely contained panic. "Our shelter was hit last week," Mrs. Gladwell explained, her voice steady despite her evident fear. "Council hasn't repaired it yet. Could we possibly—" "Of course," Edward interrupted, stepping aside to let them in. "I was just heading to the Anderson myself." Relief flooded the elderly woman's face. "Bless you. Come along, Peter." The 3 of them moved quickly through the house to the back garden where the curved iron roof of the Anderson shelter protruded from the ground, covered with sandbags and a thin layer of soil where Elizabeth had once planted nasturtiums as an act of defiance, beautiful life growing atop a refuge from death. Edward helped Mrs. Gladwell navigate the slippery steps into the shelter, then ushered young Peter inside. The space was cramped, designed for a family of 4 to sit, not lie down, but adequate. Edward had outfitted it with a shelf holding emergency supplies, 2 stools, and a narrow bench with cushions from the parlor sofa. "We won't be cold at least," he said, lighting the small paraffin heater. "That's the advantage of these over the underground, though I don't mind telling you, I prefer more earth above my head when the heavy ones drop." Mrs. Gladwell nodded understanding as she settled Peter on the bench, wrapping a blanket around his shoulders. "Thank you for taking us in. The neighbors we usually shelter with have gone to stay with family in Wales." The distinctive crump of anti-aircraft guns began, followed by the distant drone of aircraft engines growing steadily louder. "Sounds like they're coming from the east again," Edward observed, his ear trained by months of listening to the patterns of air raids. "Probably heading for the docks." Peter's face crumpled at the intensifying sounds. "Will they bomb us?" Edward sat beside the boy, his manner gentle but matter-of-fact. "They're after factories and shipyards, not houses with little boys in them. But sometimes their bombs go astray, which is why we're being sensible and waiting in this strong shelter until they leave." The boy seemed to consider this. "Like hiding from bullies at school, something like that," Edward agreed. "Though these particular bullies are much less clever than you or me." A stick of bombs fell somewhere to the north, the sequence of explosions rumbling through the ground beneath them. Peter flinched, pressing against his grandmother's side. "I was about your age when I saw my first Zeppelin," Edward said conversationally, deliberately keeping his voice steady and calm. "During the Great War, huge silver things in the sky, like giant cigars, terrified us all at first. My father built a shelter in our cellar with old railway sleepers, not nearly as good as this one. The distraction technique worked." Peter looked up, momentarily forgetting his fear. "Did they drop bombs too?" "They did, but nothing like these new planes. Progress, they call it," Edward said with a wry smile, "though some kinds of progress I think we could do without." As the raid intensified, Edward continued sharing stories of London before the war, of double-decker buses with open tops, of boat races on the Thames, of the great Crystal Palace before it burned. Mrs. Gladwell occasionally added her own memories, and gradually Peter's terror subsided into curiosity. The shelter list hung on a nail by the door, a reminder of Elizabeth's practical wisdom. Edward had added only one item to her meticulous inventory: stories for the little ones. Perhaps the most essential supply of all. The all-clear siren wailed its welcome relief after 40 minutes of tension. Edward helped Mrs. Gladwell and Peter up the shelter steps, emerging into a world transformed yet again. Smoke billowed from several points on the horizon, but their immediate neighborhood appeared to have been spared this time. "You're welcome to stay for tea," Edward offered, but Mrs. Gladwell shook her head. "Best get home and check on things." "Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Come along, Peter." As they departed, Edward glanced at his pocket watch. Nearly noon, the community kitchen would be serving lunch soon. His larder had grown increasingly sparse as rationing tightened, and the communal meals provided both nourishment and company. Edward retrieved his ration book from the kitchen drawer, the carefully preserved stamps representing his weekly allowance of necessity. The small booklet had become as important as his identity papers. No food without ration coupons, no coupons without proper registration. The system kept everyone fed, if not well fed. He tucked the book into his breast pocket and set off towards St. Mary's Church Hall, where the Women's Voluntary Service had established one of many community feeding centres across London. The route took him past fresh bomb damage from the morning raid, a terrace of houses now reduced to smoking rubble. Fire crews still worked to contain lingering flames, while rescue workers dug through debris, searching for survivors or bodies. Edward paused to ask if they needed an extra pair of hands, but the warden waved him on. "Got enough for now, Thompson. They're bringing dogs in soon." The line outside St. Mary's stretched down the block, Londoners of all ages and social stations queuing patiently for what might be their only hot meal of the day. Edward joined the back, nodding to familiar faces. "Hear about the shelter on Carlisle Street?" asked Mr. Perkins, a retired railway worker who lived alone since his wife had been evacuated to their daughters in Suffolk. Edward shook his head. "Direct hit. They're still counting." A collective murmur of sympathy passed through those close enough to hear. Another tragedy in a city where tragedy had become commonplace. Someone mentioned a prayer service scheduled for that evening, weather and air raids permitting. The line shuffled forward gradually. Inside the hall, long tables had been arranged in rows, and volunteers served stew and bread from massive pots. Edward presented his ration book, receiving a stamp in exchange for his portion. The system was meticulously fair, the same amount for each person, regardless of status. Equality through scarcity. "Vegetable today, Mr. Thompson," said the server, a young woman whose wedding ring hung on a chain around her neck, a widow's tribute. "Got lucky with a delivery from Kent." Edward thanked her and found a seat beside an elderly man he recognized from the underground shelter. They ate in companionable silence for several minutes, the simple food tasting remarkably good after the morning's tension. 2 tables away, a young woman struggled to manage her meal while holding an infant. Without her asking, Edward collected his empty bowl and made his way to the serving station again. "Another portion, please." For the young mother there. The server hesitated. "That's against regulations, Mr. Thompson. 1 portion per ration card." Edward smiled gently and removed a small brass gear from his pocket. "Perhaps this might help repair that broken clock in the vestry." The woman's eyes brightened. As the church caretaker's daughter, she'd mentioned the broken timepiece to Edward weeks ago. With a quick glance to ensure no supervisors were watching, she ladled a generous serving into a clean bowl and passed it over. Edward delivered it to the young mother, who looked up in surprise and gratitude. "My husband's with the Navy," she explained, though no explanation was needed. "Been 8 months since he's seen the little one. He's fighting so this one will have a better world," Edward said, nodding toward the sleeping infant. "We're all doing our part." As he left the hall, Edward overheard snippets of conversation, rumors of invasion preparations, whispers of secret weapons being developed, debates about Churchill's latest speech. Everyone had theories, everyone had fears. Information like food was rationed and substituted and shared. His own ration book, folded carefully back into his pocket, was lighter by 1 stamp, but had purchased more than mere sustenance. It had bought him a place in this improvised family of survivors, all bound together by shared sacrifice and the simple, radical act of continuing. Edward walked slowly back toward Pembridge Street, his steps measured and deliberate. At the corner of Westbourne Grove, he paused, checking his watch against the church clock, both showing just after 1 o'clock. If the day's pattern held true, the post would be delivered soon. The sight of the familiar Royal Mail van navigating the rubble-strewn street brought an unexpected lump to Edward's throat. Such ordinary things had become extraordinary in their persistence, the postal service continuing despite depleted staff, damaged sorting offices, and the constant interruption of air raids. Edward quickened his pace, arriving at his front gate just as the letter carrier approached. "Afternoon, Mr. Thompson." Frank Wilson had been delivering post in this neighborhood for over 20 years. His left sleeve hung empty now, a casualty of Dunkirk, but he'd returned to his route as soon as he was discharged from hospital. "Got something for you today." Edward's heart quickened. The unopened letter Frank extended bore the distinctive markings of military correspondence. "From Thomas?" Edward asked, his voice carefully controlled as he accepted the envelope. Frank nodded. Field Post Office stamp is North African Theatre. Your boys with the 8th Army then. Desert Rats, Edward confirmed, pride momentarily overcoming anxiety. Tank Regiment. Good lads, those Desert Rats. Give Rommel hell, they do. Frank's face softened. Forgive an old postman's nosiness, but it's been, what, 3 months since his last letter? 4, Edward said quietly. Each day without word had added another small weight to the constant burden of worry. Frank clapped him gently on his right shoulder. Well, there you have it. Good news today, eh? I'll be off then. Still half the street to cover. Edward watched him continue down the road, his letter bag considerably lighter than in pre-war days. Most correspondence now consisted of official notices, military letters, or the dreaded telegrams that no one wished to deliver or receive. The envelope felt almost weightless in Edward's hand, yet it contained the gravity of his son's voice, preserved across thousands of miles. He sat on the front step, unwilling to wait until he was inside to open this precious connection to Thomas. His fingers trembled slightly as he carefully slit the envelope with his pocket knife. The thin paper inside was covered with Thomas's distinctive handwriting, always slightly tilted to the right, just as his smile had been since childhood. Dear Dad, Edward read quietly. Sorry for the long silence. We've been on the move and censorship is strict about locations. Can tell you I've seen more sand than I thought existed in the world, and the desert nights are colder than a London winter. Edward absorbed each word like rainfall on parched earth. Thomas wrote of his tank crew, now family to him, and of seeing stars clearer than he'd ever witnessed in London skies. Between the lines, Edward could read the things military censors wouldn't allow. The fear, the exhaustion, the moments of terror punctuating long stretches of boredom. Midway through the second page, Edward's breath caught. Margaret wrote that she's expecting. Imagine me a father. Though with the baby due in April and us out here, who knows when I'll meet the little nipper. Keep an eye on them for me, Dad. Tell my future son or daughter about their old man, just in case. Edward folded the letter carefully and returned it to the envelope. Thomas hadn't said the words directly, couldn't with censors reading every line, but the message was clear. He feared he might not return, might never see his child. The weight of the unopened letter had been replaced by a different heaviness. Edward sat motionless on the step, torn between relief at knowing his son was alive and the renewed fear that accompanied each day of separation. From the west came the distant sound of aircraft, too early for the evening raids, probably just reconnaissance planes or returning RAF bombers. Nevertheless, the sound prompted Edward to rise, tuck the precious letter into his inside pocket, close to his heart. He had another decision to make. Margaret lived across London in Hampstead, a journey of several miles through unpredictable streets and uncertain skies. The sensible choice would be to wait, perhaps write her a letter, sharing news of her brother, but sensible choices were luxuries of peacetime. Edward stepped inside to collect his gas mask and identity card. The letter from Thomas seemed to pulse against his chest, a message that demanded delivery in person today, while there was still daylight and a pause between raids. Edward stood at the bus stop on Westbourne Grove, one of dozens waiting for transport that had become increasingly unreliable as the bombing damaged roads and vehicles alike. He checked his pocket watch, the one his father had given him on his 18th birthday, just before he enlisted for the Great War. The silver case was worn smooth from decades of handling, the inscription inside faded but still legible. To Edward, time passes, love remains. The watch showed 2:15. If luck was with him, he could reach Margaret's flat before dark, share Thomas's letter, and perhaps return home before the evening raids began. If luck was against him, well, Hampstead had shelters too. The number 27 bus appeared around the corner, moving with deliberate caution around a newly formed crater in the road. A ragged cheer went up from the waiting crowd, a small victory in a day of small victories and defeats. Edward joined the queue to board, noticing how the passengers arranged themselves with the practiced efficiency of those accustomed to making space where none existed. A young woman with an infant was ushered to a seat by an elderly man who then stood, gripping the rail with gnarled fingers. A girl in Land Army uniform sat with a basket of produce on her lap, fresh vegetables from the countryside that would fetch good prices in London markets. The conductor, a woman in her 50s, who had likely taken over the role from a man now in uniform, moved efficiently through the crowded aisle. "Hampstead, please," Edward said, presenting the correct fare. Bit of a journey today, she replied, punching his ticket. Northern lines closed after Chalk Farm. Unexploded one they're still working on. Edward nodded, understanding. I'll find my way. The bus lurched forward, joining the sparse traffic of military vehicles, essential services, and other buses. Through the windows, Edward watched London scroll past, a city transformed yet instantly recognizable. Church spires stood like sentinels among gaps where buildings had once been. People moved with purpose along the streets, carrying on with an outward normalcy that belied the constant tension underneath. Each neighborhood told its own story of the war. Bayswater with its elegant homes, some now missing like teeth knocked from a once perfect smile. Paddington with increased military presence around the crucial railway station. St. John's Wood, where large houses had been requisitioned for government use, windows blacked out with tape and paper. At Baker Street, the bus stopped abruptly. A man slumped on the pavement, surrounded by concerned citizens. Heart attack, looks like, said a passenger near Edward, or maybe delayed shock. Happens sometimes after a bombing. People carry on for days, then just collapse. The conductor descended to help, returning a few minutes later. RP wardens radioed for an ambulance, where to carry on. As they continued northward, Edward noticed a young man in civilian clothes with a bandaged head standing unsteadily at the next stop. Without hesitation, he rose and moved toward the exit. "Take my seat," he told the injured man as the bus stopped. "I can stand." The man's eyes, one partially obscured by bandages, registered surprised gratitude. "Jerry got our factory in Clerkenwell last night. 6 of us made it out." Edward nodded sympathy. "My son's with the 8th Army. North Africa." A simple exchange of information, yet it formed an immediate bond of understanding. They were all soldiers in this war, whether in uniform or not. The bus journey continued, interrupted twice more by detours around bomb damage. At Chalk Farm, the conductor confirmed what she'd warned earlier. "End of the line for us. Roads blocked ahead." Edward joined the passengers disembarking into unfamiliar territory. Signs directed pedestrians around cordoned areas where bomb disposal squads worked on unexploded ordnance. The normal 15-minute journey from here to Margaret's would likely take 40 minutes by this diverted route. With Thomas's letter secure in his pocket, the pocket watch keeping steady time, Edward set off on foot through a landscape where familiar landmarks had become optional, where buildings he'd known all his life might or might not still exist around the next corner. Each step forward was an act of faith in a London transformed but enduring. Margaret's flat occupied the first floor of a Victorian house in a tree-lined Hampstead street that had, thus far, escaped major bombing. Edward climbed the front steps, noticing the blackout curtains already in place despite the afternoon hour. Margaret had always been one for preparation. He knocked, hearing movement inside before the door opened to reveal his daughter. At 32, Margaret had Elizabeth's eyes and determined chin. Now she also had the unmistakable roundness of advanced pregnancy beneath her loose-fitting dress. "Dad," her surprise gave way immediately to concern. "Is everything all right? You never come without telephoning first." Edward patted his pocket. "I have a letter from Thomas." Margaret's face brightened as she stepped back to let him enter. "Come in, quickly. You shouldn't be traveling across London these days." The flat was warm and smelled of baking, a luxury made possible by Margaret's position as a secretary at the Ministry of Food, which gave her occasional access to ingredients beyond basic rations. On a small table near the window sat her current project, a hand-knit baby blanket in soft yellow wool, half completed but already beautiful in its intricate pattern. "I've just put the kettle on," Margaret said, leading him to the sitting room. "James won't be home until 6, extra shifts at the hospital again." Edward sat in the armchair, watching as his daughter moved with the slight awkwardness of someone carrying precious cargo. Her husband James, a doctor at the London hospital, had been working double shifts since the bombing began, coming home only to sleep before returning to the endless flow of casualties. "How are you feeling?" Edward asked, studying her face for signs of the fatigue Elizabeth had shown during her pregnancies. Margaret smiled, one hand resting protectively on her belly. "Like I'm carrying a future rugby player. He kicks all night." You know it's a boy?" "Just a feeling," Margaret said, disappearing briefly into the kitchen before returning with tea. "Now tell me about Thomas's letter." Edward removed the envelope from his pocket and handed it to her. "Read it yourself." He's well as of 3 weeks ago when this was posted. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she unfolded the thin paper. Edward watched her eyes move across the lines, pausing where his own had lingered on the mention of her pregnancy and Thomas's uncertainty about meeting his niece or nephew. He sounds... Margaret searched for the right word. Different, Edward supplied. The desert changes a man. The war changes everyone. Margaret refolded the letter carefully. At least he's alive. Mrs. Winters received a telegram last month about her nephew and the Blackett's son at Dunkirk. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of all those lost hanging in the air between them. The baby blanket on the table seemed suddenly more poignant, a soft thing being created amid such hardness, a preparation for life, while surrounded by death. "Dad," Margaret said finally, "I wish you'd consider moving in with us. Your neighborhood's been hit so many times. James says the East End and the city get the worst of it, but they're targeting everywhere now." Edward had heard this argument before. "My house is still standing. For how long? And those underground shelters are overcrowded, filthy. You could have the spare room here. And be one more worry for you and James. Besides, I'm needed there. Mrs. Finch depends on me for her morning tea. Young Timothy Wright needs someone to check on his grandmother. And I've my workshop." "Your music box," Margaret said softly. "How is it coming along?" "Nearly finished. Another week, perhaps." Margaret's eyes filled with unexpected tears. "Mother would be so proud. She always said you could create beauty from anything." The distant wail of air raid sirens interrupted the moment. Edward and Margaret exchanged glances of practiced resignation. "The shelter in the garden is ready," Margaret said, rising with difficulty. "James reinforced it last weekend." Edward helped his daughter gather the essentials: gas masks, a thermos of tea, blankets, the battery wireless. As they made their way downstairs, Margaret's hand clutched the baby blanket she'd grabbed at the last moment. The small Anderson shelter in the back garden was indeed well maintained, with 2 bunks and a small stool. As they settled inside and secured the door, Edward noticed how Margaret placed the partially finished blanket on her lap, fingers automatically returning to the knitting needles. "For luck," she explained, seeing his gaze. "Every stitch is a wish for his future." Outside, the familiar symphony of war began, the drone of aircraft, the percussion of anti-aircraft guns, the terrible whistling descent of bombs finding targets elsewhere in London. The all-clear sounded after 40 minutes, a relatively short raid by London standards. Edward and Margaret emerged from the shelter to find the neighborhood intact, though smoke rose from several points on the horizon. "I have an appointment at the hospital at 4, Margaret said, checking her watch. "Prenatal checkup. You should come with me, Dad. It's on your way back and you can see James briefly." Edward agreed, knowing the real reason for her invitation. She didn't want him traveling across London alone so soon after a raid. As they prepared to leave, Margaret insisted he take a small package of scones she'd baked that morning. "For your neighbors in the shelter," she said firmly. At the hall table, Margaret retrieved her medical identification card from her handbag, a simple piece of pasteboard that had become as essential as ration books in wartime Britain. The card, issued before the war, still showed her maiden name and bore the stamps of routine visits that chronicled the quiet rhythm of peacetime health monitoring, now interrupted by the violent syncopation of war. The walk to the Royal Free Hospital took them down streets where RRP wardens were already assessing minor damage from the raid. A water main had burst on one corner, and workers were attempting to stem the flow while citizens filled buckets, water being almost as precious as information in bombed London. The hospital itself showed signs of recent damage. Scaffolding covered one wing, and several windows had been replaced with plywood. Despite this, the routine of medicine continued with remarkable normality. Nurses in starched uniforms moved efficiently through corridors. Expectant mothers waited on benches, exchanging tips on stretching rations for growing families. "Mrs. Preston," called a nurse, using Margaret's married name. "Doctor will see you now." Edward followed Margaret into a small examination room where a middle-aged doctor was reviewing notes. He looked up, recognition lighting his tired face. "Edward Thompson, didn't expect to see you here." "Dr. Lawrence," Edward stood to shake his hand. "You're Margaret's doctor." "Indeed I am. We served together in the Ramsey at Paschendale. Margaret, your father saved my life when our aid station took a direct hit." Margaret looked between them with surprise. "You never told me that, Dad." Edward shrugged. Many things from that war weren't worth telling. Dr. Lawrence nodded understanding before turning his attention to Margaret. "Let's check on this baby of yours, shall we?" Edward moved to leave, but Margaret caught his hand. "Stay, please." The examination proceeded with Dr. Lawrence's gentle efficiency. Edward stood by the window, watching his daughter's face as she listened to the baby's heartbeat through the doctor's stethoscope, her expression transforming with wonder. "Strong and steady," Dr. Lawrence confirmed. "You're doing remarkably well, especially given the circumstances. Many expectant mothers are showing signs of stress from the raids. My husband ensures I eat properly," Margaret said. "Hospital connections help with that." Dr. Lawrence smiled. "James is an excellent doctor, and husband clearly." He made notes in her file before adding more seriously, "Have you considered evacuation? Many women in your condition are being sent to the country for the final months." Margaret's expression hardened with familiar Thompson stubbornness. "My husband's here, my work's here, I'm staying." "As I expected you'd say," Dr. Lawrence replied. "But I had to ask. Now I'd like to see you again in 2 weeks rather than the usual month." The stress of the sudden wail of sirens cut him off. Another raid, so soon after the last, was unusual and concerning. "That's the hospital warning," Dr. Lawrence explained, rising. "We've had several near misses. Standard procedure is to move patients to the basement shelter." Edward helped Margaret gather her things as staff appeared at the door to direct them downstairs. The hospital's response was impressively organized. Patients in wheelchairs and on gurneys were already being efficiently transported by nurses and orderlies. In the basement, bedsheets had been hung to create private areas for the most vulnerable patients. Doctors continued their rounds by lamplight. Margaret was shown to a section designated for expectant mothers, where several women sat on folding chairs, their expressions ranging from fear to weary resignation. Edward found himself standing next to a man in a white coat staring up at the ceiling as if he could see through it to the sky beyond. "Your first raid in the hospital?" the man asked, noticing Edward's gaze. "First time in any hospital since 1918, Edward replied. The doctor nodded. "Different war, same injuries, just more civilians this time." He extended his hand. "Dr. Preston, you must be Margaret's father." The raid lasted longer this time, nearly 2 hours of distant explosions, while the hospital operated with practiced efficiency in its basement shelter. Edward spent the time with James, his son-in-law's brief break from surgery, providing a rare opportunity to speak about Margaret's pregnancy without her stubborn insistence that everything was perfectly fine. "She's strong," James said, his surgical hands cupping a mug of tea brought by a volunteer. "But the stress isn't good for either of them. The lack of proper nutrition, the disrupted sleep during raids." He trailed off, the unspoken dangers hanging between them. "She gets that determination from her mother," Edward replied. Elizabeth would have stayed in London too. When the all clear finally sounded, Edward found Margaret waiting for him near the hospital entrance, her face showing the strain of the prolonged shelter stay. "You should rest here tonight," she urged. "It'll be dark soon, and the evening raids will start." Edward shook his head. "I need to check on the house, and I've left my work in progress." Seeing her ready to argue, he added, "I promise to stay in the underground shelter tonight." Their goodbye was lengthened by the war. Each farewell now carried the weight of potential permanence. Margaret clung to him a moment longer than usual. "Come back Sunday if you can," she said. "James is off rotation. We'll have a proper lunch. I'll bring the music box if it's finished," Edward promised. The bus queue stretched along the hospital perimeter wall, Londoners eager to reach home before darkness brought the bombers again. Edward joined the line, noticing how conversations ebbed and flowed around him, snippets of ordinary life persisting amid extraordinary circumstances. When the bus finally arrived, it bore evidence of the city's ongoing ordeal. One window had been replaced with wood, and the conductor's ticket punch was damaged, missing its handle and bound together with string and wire, ingenious repairs that exemplified London's make-do spirit. "Bayswater, please," Edward said, presenting his fare. "Only going as far as Marble Arch," the conductor replied, expertly manipulating her damaged punch. "Bridge damage ahead, you'll need to change." Edward nodded understanding and found a seat near the back. The bus wound its cautious way through streets increasingly shadowed by approaching evening. Workers were hurrying homeward, and the first blackout curtains were being drawn across windows. At Oxford Street, the bus stopped unexpectedly. Through the windows, Edward saw civil defense volunteers directing a line of people with buckets and containers. A water main had been hit, and civilians were being allowed to collect the precious liquid before it was shut off. Without hesitation, Edward descended from the bus and joined a group of men helping to fill containers for elderly residents. An RP warden handed him a shovel to clear debris from around the flowing water. "Much obliged," the warden said when enough containers had been filled. "Might save lives if there's fires tonight." Edward checked his watch as he rejoined the bus queue. Nearly 6 o'clock, the time when James would normally be arriving home to Margaret, when Thomas would once have been returning from his apprenticeship, when Elizabeth would have been setting the table for dinner. The ghost routines of peacetime haunted the disrupted patterns of war. The replacement bus was more crowded, filled with office workers from government buildings heading westward. Edward stood, gripping the overhead rail, his body swaying with the vehicle's motion. Beside him, a young woman in the uniform of the Women's Royal Naval Service stared ahead with exhausted eyes. "Long day?" Edward asked. She nodded without elaboration. Security consciousness had become second nature to Londoners. Loose talk costs lives, as the posters reminded everyone. As the bus approached Bayswater, Edward's thoughts turned to the remaining walk home and the decision awaiting him there. Should he retrieve more of his tools and the music box components before heading to the underground shelter, or was there time to work a little longer in his own basement, perhaps even risk sleeping in his Anderson shelter if the raid seemed concentrated elsewhere? The bus conductor moved down the aisle, announcing the stop. Edward prepared to disembark, joining the stream of passengers descending into streets already dark beneath the blackout. The familiar weight of his gas mask box knocked against his hip, and in his pocket the damaged ticket stub served as a small reminder that even in brokenness, London carried on. Dusk settled over London like a held breath. Edward moved through his house with practiced efficiency, using the remaining daylight to avoid wasting precious battery power. He gathered essentials for the night: a change of clothes, his shaving kit, a small notebook where he recorded the daily transformations of his neighborhood. On the kitchen table sat his battery-powered wireless radio, its casing scuffed from frequent transport between house and shelter. Edward had purchased it in the first week of the Blitz, understanding immediately that information would be as necessary for survival as food and water. The BBC had become the heartbeat of wartime Britain, connecting isolated citizens through news, music, and the reassuring voices of announcers who continued broadcasting through the worst of the bombing. Edward switched it on, adjusting the volume as the 6 o'clock news began. The familiar voice spoke of advances in North Africa, diplomatic developments in Washington, and industrial production exceeding targets. Between the official accounts, Edward had learned to hear what wasn't being said. The absence of specific locations in bombing reports meant heavy civilian casualties. Vague references to operations continuing usually signaled setbacks at the front. He prepared a simple meal from his rations while half listening to the broadcast, a slice of national loaf spread thinly with margarine, accompanied by tea that had already been brewed twice. As he ate, the news gave way to a recorded speech from Churchill, the Prime Minister's distinctive cadence filling the small kitchen. "We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." Though Edward had heard these words before, they still stirred something deep within him. Churchill understood what all Londoners now knew, that ordinary endurance could become extraordinary resistance. The wireless continued with music as Edward packed his rucksack for the night. Into a side pocket went his pipe and tobacco ration, a small comfort during long shelter hours. Wrapped in a clean handkerchief were the remaining scones from Margaret. Finally, he carefully placed his current book, a well-worn copy of Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities, borrowed from a mobile library, into the main compartment. He debated whether to bring the music box components. The shelter's dim lighting made detailed work difficult, but the alternative was leaving them here, vulnerable to damage if the house took a hit. After a moment's hesitation, he wrapped the mechanical parts in soft cloth and tucked them into his jacket's inside pocket. The wooden case, still needing final sanding and finishing, he left on his workbench. Some tasks simply required proper tools and space. The wireless announcer's voice became suddenly urgent, interrupting Edward's preparations. "We are receiving reports of enemy aircraft formations approaching the southeast coast. Citizens in London and surrounding areas should be prepared to seek shelter within the next hour." Edward checked his watch. 6:45. Earlier than usual for the first raiders to appear. He would need to leave soon to secure a decent space in the underground. Before switching off the wireless, he turned the dial to find the German propaganda broadcast, "Know your enemy," his old sergeant had always said. The female announcer, speaking English with a pronounced German accent, was claiming that Britain was near collapse, that the bombing was breaking civilian morale, that surrender was inevitable. Edward smiled grimly as he turned off the radio. If German intelligence believed that, they didn't understand London or Londoners at all. A sudden hammering at his front door interrupted his thoughts. "Mr. Thompson, Mr. Thompson, are you there?" Young Timothy Wright's voice carried a note of panic. Edward opened the door to find the boy breathless on his step. "Gran's fallen and can't get up. Mum's at her factory shift. Can you help us get to the shelter?" Edward grabbed his rucksack and gas mask. "Of course, lad. Let's go." As he pulled the door closed behind him, Edward glanced back at the silent wireless on the table. The BBC would continue broadcasting through the raid, voices reaching out through the darkness, connecting unseen listeners across a city under siege. If his house was still standing tomorrow, the radio would be waiting to deliver the morning news. If not, well, there would be other radios, other broadcasts, other days. The first distant drone of aircraft engines became audible as Edward followed Timothy down the darkening street. Edward helped Mrs. Wright onto her sofa while Timothy gathered her shelter necessities: medication, identity card, a small photo album. The elderly woman's ankle was swollen but not broken, and she insisted they proceed to the underground once Edward had wrapped it tightly with a bandage from her first aid kit. "Timothy, run ahead and save us places," Edward instructed, knowing the shelters filled quickly after the early warnings. "We'll follow more slowly." As the boy dashed off, Edward helped Mrs. Wright to her feet. "Lean on me. We have time yet." Outside, the street had emptied as Londoners made their practiced way to shelters. The fading light and absence of people gave the neighborhood an eerie, abandoned quality, a nightly transformation from bustling community to ghost town. "I need to stop at my house," Edward told Mrs. Wright as they slowly made their way. "Just for a moment. I've left something important." She nodded understanding, conserving her breath for the difficult walk. Inside his house, Edward moved quickly to his workshop. The decision had crystallized during their slow progress from Mrs. Wright's home. He would complete the music box tonight, raid or no raid. He gathered the remaining materials, including a small piece of wood he'd been saving for the final detail. The wood had come from the altar rail of St. Mary's Church, destroyed in October. Edward had salvaged it from the rubble, recognizing the polished oak where he and Elizabeth had knelt together on their wedding day. The church verger, seeing him standing amid the devastation with the small piece clutched in his hand, had simply nodded approval. "Better in loving hands than in German ashes," the man had said. Edward wrapped everything carefully and added it to his rucksack, then rejoined Mrs. Wright for their cautious journey to Holborn Station. The entrance was crowded, but Timothy had succeeded in his mission. The boy waved from the stairwell, where he'd saved a space on the less populated northern platform. Edward helped Mrs. Wright navigate the stairs, grateful for the assistance of a Home Guard volunteer who carried her small case. "Back again, Eddie?" Mrs. Finch called from her established corner. "Brought us company, I see." Edward made introductions as he settled Mrs. Wright beside his regular shelter mates. Space was already at a premium, with families arranging blankets on every available surface. The platforms that had once seen the rush-hour bustle of commuters now hosted a different kind of London life, an underground community with its own rules and rhythms. "First warning came early tonight," Mr. Pembridge observed, his wireless already tuned to the shelter frequency that provided updates throughout raids. "They're saying heavy formations over Kent." Edward nodded, arranging his small area with practiced efficiency. Unlike many who attempted to sleep during the long hours, he preferred to keep his mind occupied. From his rucksack, he removed the music box components and the small tool set he'd assembled for shelter work. "Still at it then?" Mrs. Finch asked, watching him lay out the pieces on a handkerchief spread across his lap. "Final assembly tonight, I think," Edward replied. "Most of the precision work is done." Under the dim shelter lighting, he began fitting the mechanisms together. The platform around him hummed with quiet conversation, punctuated by the distant thumps of bombs and anti-aircraft fire from above. Children too young to understand danger played quiet games. Volunteers moved through the crowds distributing tea from huge urns. Edward's fingers worked steadily, connecting the spring mechanism to the cylinder studded with precisely placed pins. Each pin would strike a different metal tine as the cylinder rotated, creating the notes of green sleeves. He had tested each component separately. Tonight would determine if they harmonized as intended. The piece of church wood would form the final decorative element, a small cross inlaid into the lid, visible only when the box was open. Elizabeth would have appreciated the symbolism, faith preserved, beauty rescued from destruction. As he worked, Edward found himself humming the melody softly. Mrs. Wright, her pain temporarily forgotten, watched with interest. "For your wife?" she asked. "For her, for my daughter, for the grandchild coming in spring." Edward's hands continued their precise movements, something that plays rather than destroys, a small act of creation amid all this. Around them the shelter settled into its nightly routine, a subterranean village of strangers becoming neighbors. Above, London endured another assault, but here, in this underground cavern, with salvaged wood and repurposed metal, Edward Thompson continued his quiet defiance, crafting music from the materials of war. The night progressed with the now familiar rhythms of shelter life. Edward worked steadily on the music box, pausing occasionally to help distribute tea or assist newcomers finding space in the increasingly crowded platform. Above, the raid intensified, the distant explosions growing closer, the shelter occasionally trembling with near impacts. Mr. Pembridge's wireless crackled with updates. "Heavy bombing in the city and West End," announced the steady BBC voice, "fire services responding." Edward's thoughts turned to his house and workshop, vulnerable beneath the falling bombs. The Air Raid Precautions Handbook, resting beside Mrs. Wright, contained the official advice he had followed meticulously. Sand buckets positioned by doors, blackout curtains precisely fitted, furniture arranged away from windows, valuables stored in the sturdiest part of the house. Yet experience had taught all Londoners that such preparations offered limited protection against direct hits. He'd first obtained the handbook in 1938, during the Munich crisis, when war had seemed imminent before being temporarily postponed. The government-issued booklet, with its matter-of-fact descriptions of incendiary bombs and gas attacks, had seemed alarmist then. Now its clinical language fell woefully short of describing the reality of life under bombardment. A particularly close explosion shook dust from the ceiling, causing a momentary hush in conversation before Londoners, determined not to show fear, resumed their activities with deliberate normalcy. Edward returned to his work, aligning the final gears that would translate the hand-crank motion into the cylinder's rotation. "Is that for your grandbaby?" asked a young woman sitting nearby, watching his careful manipulations with interest. Eventually, Edward replied, "Started it for my late wife." The woman nodded, understanding. Like most Londoners, she knew better than to press further. Everyone carried private losses beneath their public resilience. Around 9 o'clock, a commotion at the station entrance drew attention. A family arrived in obvious distress, parents with soot-blackened faces guiding 3 children whose expressions reflected shock rather than fear. "Direct hit on Gloucester Terrace," explained the father to the shelter warden. "Lost everything. Neighbors too." The shelter's communal spirit mobilized instantly. Space was made, blankets offered, a doctor summoned from further along the platform to check the youngest child for shock. Within minutes, the family was absorbed into the underground community, their immediate needs addressed with the efficiency of those well-practiced in disaster response. Edward watched the children, 2 girls and a boy, ranging from perhaps 4 to 10 years old, and thought of his own coming grandchild. What kind of London would await that new life? Would the raid still be continuing in April, when Margaret was due? Would there still be a city standing to welcome the next generation? He turned his attention back to the music box, now nearing completion. Only the final adjustments remained, calibrating the spring tension, ensuring smooth movement of the cylinder, securing the decorative elements to the wooden case. The hummingbird carving, already attached to its mounting pin, waited to take flight when the lid opened. "Mr. Thompson." Timothy Wright appeared at his side, eyes wide. "The warden says Pembridge Street's been hit, whole western end." Edward's hands stilled. His house stood at the eastern end of the street, but close enough to be damaged by a significant blast. He carefully wrapped the music box components in their cloth, tucking them into his bag, before rising to speak with the warden. "Any details?" he asked the uniformed man who was marking a large wall map with the latest impact sites. "Incendiaries followed by high explosive," the warden replied grimly. "Fire crews responding, but they're stretched thin tonight. Can't say about specific houses yet." Edward nodded thanks and returned to his seat, facing the reality all Londoners lived with, nightly, that they might emerge from shelter to find their homes and possessions reduced to rubble, their past erased while they sheltered their bodies underground. Mrs. Finch patted his hand silently, understanding without words. Edward resumed his work on the music box with renewed purpose. If his house was gone, this small object, containing memories of Elizabeth, fragments of their church, the promise of continuity through Margaret's child, might be all that remained of his previous life. Around him, the underground shelter continued its nightly transformation into a temporary community, bound by shared danger. Children were settled for sleep on blankets, volunteers distributed more tea, a young man played quiet songs on a harmonica, and throughout it all, London above them burned and endured. As midnight approached, the shelter had settled into its nocturnal routine. Families huddled together on blankets, children sleeping despite the distant thunder of bombs. Those unable to sleep engaged in quiet conversations or solitary activities illuminated by the dim emergency lighting. Near the platform wall hung a large chalkboard that had once displayed train schedules but now served as the shelter's information center. Neatly written announcements listed water conservation rules, lost and found items, and tomorrow's volunteer roster for tea distribution. A corner of the board was dedicated to personal messages, desperate communications between separated family members seeking reunion. Edward paused in his work on the music box to study the board. 3 new names had been added to the list of those missing after last night's heavy raids. A request for baby clothes for a child born prematurely during an alert, an appeal for blood donors at the Royal London Hospital, the ordinary business of humanity continuing beneath extraordinary circumstances. "Mr. Thompson?" A young woman approached hesitantly. "Mrs. Finch says you're good with repairs." She held out a small mechanical toy soldier whose arm had broken off. "It's my son's, only thing we saved when our flat was hit last week." Edward set aside his own project and examined the toy. "I can fix this. Have you the arm?" She produced the tiny piece from her pocket, and Edward set to work, using his smallest tools to reattach it. The woman watched, relief evident in her expression. "He's been crying for it. First time he's been attached to anything since his father shipped out with the Navy." Around them, the underground shelter had developed its own distinct society over months of nightly occupation. Regular inhabitants had established territories marked by personal items, a folding chair saved for an elderly man who arrived late each evening after checking his shop, a corner where a former schoolteacher conducted quiet lessons for children missing formal education, a makeshift library of books circulating among readers. "There," Edward said, returning the repaired toy. "Good as new." The woman's gratitude was palpable. "What do I owe you?" "Nothing at all. Perhaps just pass along the kindness when you can." She returned to her sleeping child, and Edward resumed work on the music box. His reputation as a fixer had spread through the shelter community, bringing him a steady stream of broken items, watches that had stopped after blast impacts, eyeglasses with loose screws, toys damaged during hasty evacuations. Each repair was a small restoration of normalcy in lives disrupted by war. Eddie called Mr. Pembridge softly. "Come listen to this." He had his ear pressed to his wireless set, volume turned low to avoid disturbing sleepers. Edward joined him, hearing the unmistakable sounds of a dance orchestra playing through the static. Broadcasting from somewhere in the countryside, Mr. Pembridge explained. Imagine that, musicians playing while London burns. As it should be, Edward replied, music continuing despite everything. He returned to his seat, the distant melody reinforcing his determination to complete Elizabeth's music box. Around him, the diverse community of the shelter carried on with their nighttime adaptations. A nurse in uniform caught a few hours' sleep before her morning shift. A baker read by flashlight, marking passages in a recipe book, adapted for rationing. An elderly couple shared a thermos of tea, their wrinkled hands clasped together. These strangers had become Edward's nightly family, their faces now as familiar as those in the photographs on his mantelpiece. Mrs. Finch, with her colourful headscarves and endless supply of hard candies she shared with children, Mr. Pembridge and his precious wireless set that connected them to the outside world. Young Timothy Wright, who had appointed himself Edward's assistant, eager to learn about tools and mechanisms. The chalkboard with its messages served as the heart of this makeshift community, their collective voice, their shared notice board, their public record of births, deaths, needs and offerings. Someone had added a hopeful note at the bottom, dance in the park this Sunday, weather and Hitler permitting. This, Edward reflected as he adjusted the final spring in the music box, was London's true secret weapon against the Luftwaffe, not just the barrage balloons or anti-aircraft guns, but this stubborn insistence on continuing normal life despite abnormal circumstances, planning dances while bombs fell, repairing toys in underground shelters, creating beauty from salvaged fragments. A particularly heavy explosion shook the station, causing dust to filter down from the ceiling. Conversations paused momentarily before resuming with deliberate casualness. On the chalkboard, someone had written the day's confirmed count of German planes shot down. Beside it, in different handwriting, "Take that, Adolf." Edward smiled and returned to his work, adding his own quiet defiance to London's collective resistance. The heaviest bombing occurred shortly after 2 in the morning, a sustained assault that sent tremors through the underground station. The shelter warden's wireless reported major fires in the city, with St. Paul's Cathedral threatened but still standing. Edward worked steadily through the bombardment, his hands remaining remarkably steady despite the periodic shaking of the platform. The music box was now in its final stages of assembly. Edward had attached the small wooden cross inlay to the inside of the lid and mounted the cylinder mechanism to the base. All that remained was to connect the spring, set the tension correctly, and secure the hummingbird figure to its rotating mount. "Is it nearly done, Mr. Thompson?" Timothy had awakened and now watched the assembly with fascination. "Very nearly," Edward replied, grateful for the boy's interest. "Would you like to help with the last piece?" Timothy's eyes widened. "Could I really?" Edward showed him how to hold the tiny hummingbird carving while Edward applied a drop of glue to its base. Together they positioned it on the mounting pin, where it would rotate when the box was opened. "Perfect," Edward said as they finished. "Now we must let the glue set before we test it." The bombardment above seemed to intensify, the explosions following one another in rapid succession. Mr. Pembridge's wireless crackled with static between terse announcements. Heavy raid continuing over central London. Major fires reported in Westminster and Holborn districts. Edward looked up sharply. Holborn. They were sheltering directly beneath the targeted area. As if confirming his thought, a tremendous explosion shook the station more violently than any previous blast. Lights flickered, dust and small fragments of tile rained down from the ceiling, and several people screamed. For a terrible moment, it seemed the sanctuary of the underground might not hold. "Everyone stay calm," called the shelter warden, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "The stations were built to withstand much worse. We're safer here than anywhere else." Gradually, the shelter settled back into uneasy quiet, though many who had been sleeping were now awake, mothers clutching children closer, elderly people gazing upward with expressions that had witnessed too many wars in one lifetime. Edward returned his attention to the music box, now nearly complete, on his lap. The powerful vibration had shifted some of the components, requiring minor readjustments. He worked methodically, aware of a growing audience around him as shelter inhabitants, seeking distraction from the terror above, gathered to watch his careful assembly. "What tune will it play?" asked a young woman who had been quietly crying since the large explosion. Greensleeves, Edward replied, tightening a tiny screw. My wife's favorite. An elderly man nodded approvingly. Good English melody, that. Been around since Tudor times. Outlasted many troubles. The music box now stood complete, a simple rectangular case of polished walnut, with the internal mechanism fully assembled. Edward had left the top uncovered so that observers could see the workings, the cylinder with its carefully placed pins, the metal tines arranged to produce different notes when struck, the spring mechanism that would power the rotation. "Shall we test it?" Edward asked, looking at the gathered faces illuminated in the dim shelter light. A chorus of affirmative responses answered him. Even those who had been trying to sleep sat up with interest. With careful fingers, Edward wound the key protruding from the side of the box, feeling the spring tighten to just the right tension. Then, with a nod to Timothy, who had been his assistant in these final stages, he released the catch. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the cylinder began to rotate, its pins striking the metal tines in sequence. The familiar notes of Greensleeves emerged, a bit tinny, slightly hesitant at first, but unmistakably the ancient English melody that had been Elizabeth's favorite. As the tune played, the small wooden hummingbird began to rotate on its axis, catching the light as it spun. The shelter fell completely silent, except for the music, the distant thunder of bombs momentarily forgotten. Edward watched the mechanism work, each gear turning precisely, each note sounding clearly, the cylinder rotating at exactly the correct speed. After months of work, interrupted by raids and rationing and all the disruptions of war, Elizabeth's music box was complete, the melody concluded with the final notes of the folk tune, the cylinder completing its rotation and coming to rest. For a moment, the silence in the shelter seemed absolute. Then spontaneous applause broke out, gentle at first, then swelling as more people joined in. "Play it again," called several voices, and Edward obligingly rewound the mechanism. As the music sounded for a second time, he observed the faces around him, tension momentarily eased, smiles appearing on careworn features, a few older listeners even quietly singing along with the familiar melody. "It's beautiful," Mrs. Finch said softly, touching Edward's arm. "Elizabeth would be so proud." The all-clear siren wailed its long, steady note just after 5 in the morning. Exhausted shelter inhabitants stirred slowly, gathering belongings, helping children into coats, preparing to emerge into whatever London had become overnight. Edward carefully packed the completed music box into his rucksack, cushioning it with his spare jumper. Mrs. Wright thanked him again for his assistance, her ankle now less swollen but still painful. Timothy proudly appointed himself as their escort for the journey home. At the shelter entrance, the warden was consulting with an RP messenger who had arrived with reports from the surface. Their grave expressions prepared the emerging Londoners for what awaited them. Pembridge Street took several hits, the warden announced as Edward approached. Eastern End mostly intact but damaged. Fire services still working on the western portion. Edward nodded acknowledgement, his face betraying no emotion as he joined the stream of people climbing the stairs toward daylight. Behind him, Mrs. Finch whispered to another shelter regular. "His house is on Pembridge Street. Eastern End, thank heaven." Emerging into the early morning air, Edward was struck first by the smell, the now familiar combination of cordite dust and the acrid scent of buildings still smoldering from incendiary bombs. The sky above was clearing, dawn breaking in streaks of pale gold that seemed incongruously beautiful against the smoke-stained horizon. "Will you be all right getting home?" Edward asked Mrs. Wright, helping her navigate the debris-strewn pavement. "Timothy and I will manage now. You go check your house," she urged, understanding his restrained anxiety. Edward made his way through streets rendered almost unrecognizable by the night's destruction. Buildings he had passed yesterday stood now as skeletal frameworks or piles of rubble. Fire crews worked steadily, their hoses snaking across roads, their exhausted faces streaked with soot and sweat. Ambulance workers moved with grim purpose, retrieving the injured and the dead from collapsed structures. As he approached Pembridge Street, his pace quickened despite his determination to prepare for the worst. Turning the final corner, he stopped, surveying the familiar row of terraced houses now transformed by bombs. 3 houses at the western end were completely destroyed, others damaged to varying degrees. Halfway along, a fire crew was still dousing the smouldering remains of what had been the corner shop. and there, still standing though visibly damaged, was number 27, Edward's home. The front window had been blown out and part of the roof was missing, but the essential structure remained. Relief washed over him as he approached, carefully navigating broken glass and roof slates that littered his front garden. Inside, fresh plaster dust coated every surface. Rain from the night had entered through the damaged roof, creating damp patches on the parlor ceiling. Yet the house stood, and within it, the accumulated treasures of his life with Elizabeth, their photographs, her books, the children's mementos, remained intact if somewhat worse for wear. Edward moved immediately to the kitchen, where he filled the battered tin kettle and set it on the spirit stove he kept for mornings after raids, when gas lines might be damaged. The familiar ritual of making tea, the first cup of a new day, represented continuity amid chaos, a small, normal act in a world turned abnormal. While the water heated, he unpacked the music box and placed it carefully on the mantelpiece beside the stopped clock and the wedding photograph. The morning light slanting through the broken window caught the polished wood, making it glow warmly against the dust-covered surroundings. Edward opened the lid, wound the mechanism, and let the gentle notes of green sleeves fill the damaged parlor. The hummingbird rotated smoothly, seeming almost alive in the golden morning light. He watched it complete its dance as the melody played through, imagining Elizabeth beside him, her hand in his as it had been when they'd listened to this tune at their wedding reception 39 years earlier. The kettle's whistle called him back to the present. Edward prepared his tea with careful precision, then carried the steaming cup back to the parlor. Standing amid the fresh destruction, sipping the hot, strong brew, he gazed out through the empty window frame at the street beyond. Already neighbors were emerging, checking on one another, beginning the now familiar process of cleaning up, boarding broken windows, collecting salvageable items from damaged homes. Mrs. Winters was sweeping her front step as if it were any ordinary morning. The Petersons, whose house had lost its entire front wall, were carefully retrieving books from an exposed bookcase. Children picked their way through debris, finding treasures in the rubble. Edward raised his cup in a silent toast to his persevering neighbors, to his absent children, to Elizabeth's memory, and to London itself, battered but unbroken in the clear morning light. The music box sat on the mantel, ready to play again, its melody a promise that some things survived even the darkest nights.